What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Krofsik. John, this is an issue that we really need to talk about because we thought they were going away at the end of the Obama administration. The idea of privatizing our prison population to any degree was taken off the table. But then when the Trump administration came in, they said, no, the whole idea, and this had gone on for a period of time, not that we're outsourcing all of our prisoners in America by any means. We still have a lot of public penitentiaries, but we were starting this process of outsourcing the prison population. So on the surface, I mean, what does that sound like to you? I mean, do you think there's any really good reason to have a private prison versus a public prison?
Well, you know, I mean, you look at anything that we privatize like that, there's really got to be good transparency, you know, to really know what's going on and where our taxpayers' money is going and how they're using it. I mean, I don't know if that's happening, but I mean, that's what it should be, and we should be looking for results. Are people coming out of these prisons better people than they went in?
Okay, because the private sector is running them much more efficiently
supposedly,
and doing a better job of rehabilitation. Well, these are the things we're exploring with Brett Burkhardt today on America Trends. But the truth of the matter is, to me, if you are going to have a private prison, and I agree with you wholeheartedly about transparency, then you've got to have some metric to say, well, look, it seems to be in your best interest if this person becomes a recidivist, because that means you have a customer base that continues to come back. I mean, in private business, that's the whole idea.
Right.
You buy once.
Right. They want repeat customers.
Right.
Absolutely.
The idea is not to rehabilitate, you would think. Now, let's talk about that, and we will in the podcast. I want you to keep that issue in your mind because that is a question that I raised with Mr. Burkhardt. The other thing is, when you do add the profit motive to it, I mean, do the costs really go down? I mean, I don't know how they do to give them the basic services, because we are told that in many public prisons, they're doing a pretty insubstantial job of rehabilitation. So will the private prison be investing more in educational programs, transitional programs? Are they doing a better job? Now, we talked about the fact that it came back during the Trump era to some degree. I don't know how quickly. I mean, it's hard to get all these numbers together. But the thing that's been in the news lately about private prisons is that a lot of these asylum seekers, when they are being detained, and we see some pretty terrible conditions, many of those are under private ownership, not the government. Yeah. So they're back in the game, not only for our domestic prisoners, but also for the asylum seekers.
Well, like I said, though, anytime taxpayers' dollars, especially, are involved, that we should know what's going on with these prisons and how they're. And are we sending too many people to prison? I mean, I don't know. It's just crazy.
Well, that's definitely going on. And, of course, Donald Trump did sign some legislation that is meant to deal with some of the excesses that we've had in our criminal justice system, and we've got to give him credit for that. Having said that, a lot of these companies are recognizing that trend, John. I mean, they're not oblivious to the fact, well, wait a minute, now they're going to take some crimes out of jail, if you will, or out of prison, but they're getting into some of the community programs, some of the more community-based alternatives to prison. Are they really the best stewards of that? Let's put it this way, John. This is the way I'll frame it, and I'll ask you. If we are the ones, society, that says you deserve to be locked away for a period of time, and we mete out the justice, and we sentence them in the way that we do, I mean, isn't it our responsibility to follow the process through and try to get them back into society as a public institution, or are we going to privatize that? And are we letting the fox into the hen house here?
Wow, that's the $1 million question.
And by the way, these private prisons, folks, we're not talking about gated communities. Well, we are actually talking about gated communities, aren't we? Well, why don't we get on with it? Brett Burkhardt is with us, and again, we will be talking today, only here on America Trends, about private prisons. With us on the line is Brett Burkhardt, a Ph.D. He is an associate professor of sociology at Oregon State University, and he's done a lot of research into the issue of private prisons. And Brett, for those who don't even understand what a private prison is, could you explain that and give us just a brief overview of the history of these private institutions?
Sure. So the modern manifestation of private prisons came up in the 1980s. The way that these private prisons work is that the government, through a contract, delegates incarceration responsibilities to a private company. That company agrees to take on all of these responsibilities associated with incarceration, and in return, they receive a payment from the government. And that payment is typically on a per inmate, per day basis.
And as it relates to why it is that a governmental agency, which has always seemingly had the responsibility to both make the laws, enforce them, and administer whatever justice is required, why would a government want to outsource that responsibility?
Well, it is important here to note that government is still in charge of writing the laws and in charge of adjudicating any transgressions of the law and handing out punishments. What's being delegated here is the execution of the punishment. And so the rationale for this has always been primarily based on cost. So the argument goes that the private sector can provide this service, incarceration, at a lower rate and perhaps even with a better quality.
Is that true?
That's a difficult question to answer. There have been many studies that have tried to compare costs, private versus public. And after 20, 30 years of this, we really can't say conclusively. These types of comparisons are very difficult to do, in large part because it's difficult to get a clean or neat comparison of a private prison that is just like a public prison. And in part, that's because private prisons typically hold different types of inmates and they serve a slightly different function. So on average, private prisons tend to hold lower risk inmates. They are lower security levels. They put certain restrictions on the types of inmates they can accept. Because they are serving somewhat different populations, the cost comparisons are really difficult to do. Depending on which side of the argument you're on, you can point to individual studies that show that the private sector is cheaper or the public sector is cheaper. But overall, in a recent synthesis of this research, the conclusion was that basically there is no clear-cut answer as to which sector is cheaper.
Now, there are these privately run federal and state prisons. Break that down for us and whether this trend is growing on one jurisdictional level as opposed to another, because after some scathing journalism about private prisons, it seemed as if the Justice Department federally was going to phase out the use of them, but that's before the Trump administration took office.
That's right. And so there's a lot to unpack here. First off, it's important to note that there is a lot of variation in the use of private prisons within the United States. So there are some states, in fact, roughly half of all states in the U.S., do not use any private prisons. There are other states who are heavily reliant on private prisons. So, for example, about 5 states keep at least a quarter of their prison population in private prisons. Now, we also have the federal prison system, and the federal system has historically been very reliant on private actors, private partners. As you mentioned, at the end of the Obama administration, it looked like that was going to change. So in August 2016, the Obama administration announced plans to phase out its use of private prisons. And they would do this over a period of several years. Now, fast forward to the election night of 2016, Donald Trump is elected, and the future of federal prison privatization looked very different. It turned out that early in the Trump administration, there was a decision to reverse the Obama decision to phase out private prisons. So in effect, we are now kind of full steam ahead on prison privatization in the Trump administration.
Well, we will get back to that in a moment. I want to get back to this issue of private prisons and how they can afford perhaps to be more cost effective. I was referring to some journalism about this issue, and of course the book that got everyone's attention was Shane Bauer, American Prison, a reporter's undercover journey into the business of punishment. And he places a lot of blame as to what he saw when he went inside the private prison system. He called these deplorable conditions in corporate-run prisons basically because they had to generate profit, and they accomplished that by slashing costs on, well, what he would perhaps refer to as niceties and like inmate counseling and dependable cell locks and the like. So he was painting a pretty dark picture of what goes on and what outsourcing really means to this industry.
That's right. So in attempts to cut cost, probably the biggest driver of cost is really labor costs. And so the book you referenced, Shane Bauer's book, is excellent, and I would highly recommend it to anyone interested in this. He points to a number of cost-cutting efforts in the prison that he worked in. But really the biggest cost savings are going to come from reduced staffing. And so that comes in the form of simply having fewer staff on site in the prison, but also compensating them less. We do have some evidence that on average, workers in private prisons are paid at much lower rates than their public counterparts. That's in large part because they are not represented by any labor union, as public prison workers often are. But you also have cost savings in the form of reduced opportunities for training. And so that's one striking anecdote that comes out of Shane Bauer's experience. The scarcity and inadequacy of the training is really quite horrifying in the prison that he worked in.
How many companies are actually out there vying for business? And he, of course, points out to the fact that the group that you talked about, CCA, lost its contract to LaSalle Corrections, and it went from $34 a day per prisoner, and LaSalle agreed to do the job for $24 a day. So we're really talking about something of a race to the bottom here. How many companies are really competing with one another?
Nowadays, there are really two big companies that dominate the market. It's CoreCivic, which previously was known as CCA, and their main rival is the Geo Group. These two companies generate about $2 million of revenue each year. There are a handful of other companies. Management and Training Corporation is one notable company. But really, it is a pretty small group of firms that are offering these services. And so one of the promises in the early days of the industry was that there would be vibrant competition among different firms to provide the best and cheapest services. But in practice today, there really isn't much competition beyond those two or three firms.
And who bears responsibility when something goes terribly wrong inside a prison? Of course, in his book, he points to a dozen stabbings and various things that go on. Is it the state or the feds still? And what about the company itself?
So there are a number of things that may happen. First, inmates themselves are really responsible for airing grievances, and oftentimes that's done in-house. And in fact, there is federal legislation that requires that when inmates have grievances, they attempt to resolve those in-house. If that can't be resolved, there is the possibility always of a lawsuit filed by prisoners, but there are a number of hurdles involved in taking these cases to the courts. It's very expensive, it's time-consuming, and it does require that you exhaust your administrative dispute resolution process first. So one corrective course of action would involve a lawsuit. It is also possible to have external monitors provided by the state or the federal government that may come in and perform audits to see how these private facilities are running and to try to identify any shortcomings. But that auditing practice in practice really is not terribly rigorous and probably not terribly effective.
Anecdotally, it's said that these private prisons take on inmate populations with fewer risks and needs, and you talked about that earlier in terms of low-risk inmates. It kind of sounds like the problem that many people have with charter schools or other kind of quasi-public private activities or other forms of outsourcing. Does it bear any of those qualities?
I think we have some evidence that this does take place, that there is a creaming or skimming of good inmates and a filtering out of bad, more expensive inmates. It's hard to know this on a system-wide basis because some of these things are going to be written into contracts. So, for example, we do have a handful of examples of contracts that specify that the private prison will not take, say, old inmates that have serious health needs. Those, of course, would be more expensive. So sometimes these things are actually written into contracts, and we do see that occasionally. But it's hard to know how widespread this is because these contracts are not publicly available. They're actually treated as commercial proprietary trade secrets. And so unlike other government agencies or government operations, including public prisons, you can't simply file a freedom of information request to get information about how these contracts are written and how these businesses run because they are treated as proprietary.
On the line with us is Brett Burkhardt, and he is an associate professor of sociology. He's done an awful lot of work on private prisons, has some great writing that you can find online about it. And speaking of that, anecdotally, it is said, and I read in your piece, Private Prisons Explained, that private prisons take on inmate populations. No, I'm sorry. I had the wrong question there. I'm sorry. Let me do that over again. With us on the line is Brett Burkhardt. He's an associate professor of sociology, Oregon State University, and has done a lot of work and research looking at private prisons, has some great work online that you can find. And you talk about the three issues that are really at play when we privatize a service like this: cost, quality, and morality. And let me get to the morality. If, in fact, these companies, I don't know what their mission statements are, but profit has to be in there. And at the same time, as a public service, what we are supposedly trying to do, and everybody has renamed their departments of prisons to departments of correction, is to avoid recidivism, to help people as they get back into society. In this case, it would seem that there is an inducement to try to get your customers back if profit is the motivation, and if, in fact, we've got criminal justice reform, which is trying to move people out of the prison mill, if you will. So is that contradictory
to some of the things that these companies must be interested in.
We do, in fact, have some evidence that inmates who are sent to private prisons do tend to spend more time there than they otherwise would, which is some evidence to back up this idea that there is an incentive to keep prisoners longer. Now, I think private prisons, for their part, are very clear and on the record as saying that they do not have an incentive to do this. It is not in their interest to keep prisoners longer than they need to be kept, and there's no incentive or interest in having them return. You do see this manifest in a couple of ways, and one is really a matter of marketing. So a number of the big companies are now rebranding segments of their corporation to focus on things like community corrections and rehabilitation and reentry. So there is clearly a recognition that, at least on a surface level, these are the things that we want to tout to the public. I think there also is a deeper recognition, though, among the industry that the old hyper-punitive days of the United States are possibly beyond us or behind us. We have seen over the last 10 years or so slight declines in the prison population, and there, for the last decade or so, has been a bipartisan push to reform the criminal justice system, to bring those prison populations down, and to treat people in a more humane manner. And so I think simply as a market opportunity, these companies are shifting more of their resources into community-based, more rehabilitative types of services. So you have the big companies in this field buying up smaller corporations that focus on providing education in the community or reentry services for people leaving prison, drug testing and drug counseling types of programs. So there really is a push into those more rehabilitative types of services.
Well, that makes sense as they see the movement in that area. How prescriptive are the contracts that are signed between the government agencies and the private contractors? And do many of them call for something other than just a daily stipend, but something that relates to outcomes, performance, some of the work release programs or the educational opportunities? Do any of them really have a broad scope of service?
Well, again, it is somewhat hard to know this because these contracts are shrouded in secrecy. But I think it is safe to say that historically the contracts have not required that the private companies provide any certain outcome. So there historically has not been any demand that, say, recidivism decrease by X percent upon receiving the contract. Now, there is something of a push in public administration right now to try to write those types of benchmarks or standards into these contracts. And so this is part of a broader movement that sometimes is called pay for success or social impact bonds. But the idea here is that private companies providing a service like incarceration will only be paid if they meet certain objective benchmarks, like, for example, a reduction in recidivism. But historically, that has not been the case.
What about the selling point made by private prisons that their being alone induces better performance by the public prisons, competition? Any evidence of that?
There is no evidence of that. And in fact, I've done some research on this question, and we can look at public prisons who operate in competitive environments because we have this variation in the extent of contracting across states in the U.S. And if there was that beneficial effect of private competition, what you would expect to see is improvement among the public prisons who are now competing in this more competitive marketplace. But in fact, you don't see that. You see simply continuation of the status quo. So there really isn't any evidence that this competition creates any system-wide improvements.
Are there any nonprofits working in this space? You would think that there are so many social service activities that there would be some nonprofit organizations which might have the desire for those benchmarks and might take that on as a due responsibility on their part. But do we see that as opposed to profit-making companies?
It's rare. At the beginning of the industry in the 80s, early 90s, there were more nonprofit organizations involved in this industry. They've really, though, been crowded out by these big for-profit companies. You do, however, see a number of nonprofit actors in the juvenile sector, so juvenile detention. There is a great deal of private activity there, and a lot of those providers are nonprofit.
Getting back to the issue of quality, you cite in some of your writings some studies suggesting higher staff turnover, more escapes, more inmate misconduct, and greater use of discipline. And these are the lower risk inmates to begin with. Is that a terribly damning finding, given who they are, in fact, locking up within these private prisons?
Well, I think so. Now, I'll note that in the studies that I referenced, there was some attempt to do an apples-to-apples comparison and try to compare those private facilities to relatively low-security facilities in the public sector. But with that said, you're right. We can point to a number of studies that do show worse outcomes and worse performance among the private sector. So a few things that you mentioned being more escapes, more inmate misconduct, staff turnover, greater use of discipline against inmates. These really are problems that appear fairly consistently in the research. Now, I don't want to overstate that because it really is the case that there are some horrendous public prisons. And so simply turning things over to the public sector will not solve these problems. But these are trends that we really need to be attentive to.
So we talked about the 3 points that are often part of the conversation when there's a debate over privatization: cost, quality, morality. Let me get to the issue of morality. It's the government's laws. They should impose the sentences and administer them, some might argue, for the betterment of society and hopefully allowing people to get some form of rehabilitation. At least that's the conversation these days as a goal, and that there shouldn't be any profit motivation in all of this. Is that what a lot of those who want to maintain the public structure only are saying?
I think so. It's a concern that has always dogged the industry, this idea that incarceration really is a fundamentally different type of service. You know, government for a long time has contracted out various services, things like garbage pickup, parks maintenance, information technology. But really, when we're talking about incarceration, this is the forcible restriction of a person's liberty and freedom. And that really is something different. And so that's been a complaint from critics since the beginning. It has sometimes been overshadowed, though, by concerns about cost, but it does drive a lot of the protests that we do see today against the industry.
At the beginning, we talked about the fact that the industry was almost on its back, but it's pretty resilient. And you say in some of your writing it's likely to grow thanks to the approaches that the Trump administration, for example, is putting on immigrant detention. And, of course, these new rehabilitation services that are more in the community, and they're beginning to respond, the private companies, to that. But this U.S. immigrant detention, we know the president has not been a big fan of immigration. So we've heard a lot of terrible stories on the border. What can we expect given the history of private prisons, if in fact they are given a mandate to take a lot of immigrant detainees? What do you imagine here?
Well, as you say, immigrant detention really is a booming area for the industry. And this has been accelerated by the Trump administration. But in fact, the private industry has, for a long time, been deeply involved in immigrant detention. And in fact, some of the earliest contracts in the 1980s were for immigrant detention. So this is not something that was created by the Trump administration. But the fact is, the administration has taken a number of moves that really are good for the private prison industry. Those things would include enhanced enforcement of immigration laws in the interior of the U.S., a failure to release people to the community while they're awaiting immigration hearings. These types of moves are going to result in more people being detained, and the private sector is there to meet that demand. So today, private firms hold about 2/3 of all immigrant detainees. So they really are well positioned to absorb these detainees.
In one of the pieces you wrote, given the apparent staying power of the private prison industry, it's worth considering how to ensure that private prisons deliver a socially desirable service. And we did talk a bit about this, but you do focus in this piece about Massachusetts and what is called a social impact bond. If you want to describe that and anything else you see on the horizon, given that our podcast is focused on where we're headed, that you think we should be looking for in this area of private detention.
Here we have an attempt to try to incentivize positive, socially beneficial outcomes. If we are going to allow private actors to administer punishments and rehabilitation, we want to set this up in a way that really is socially beneficial. And so one option is to use something called a social impact bond. And this gets complicated. I'll try to keep it fairly simple. But the way it works is that private investors will put up some money to fund some sort of a service. And this service might be a rehabilitation program that is provided to juveniles or adults in some correctional center. That private money funds the service, and the service provider then delivers the service. If the service provides or produces the socially desirable outcome, then the initial investors are paid back by the government. And so what you have is a predetermined benchmark, which may be, say, 10% reduction in recidivism. And that's used as a kind of trigger to compensate the initial investors. So as I said, it's a way of trying to build in some accountability into the system to only pay for services that work in a way. And it's also an attempt to improve the outcomes of these correctional services.
Brett Burkhardt, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. A lot of people have heard of private prisons, perhaps some. This is a new aspect of detention that they're not aware of, but they now are thanks to all the work that you have done. If anybody wants to read your writing on this topic, we already talked about American Prison, Shane Bauer, a great book to get. Where can they read some of the material that you've been, discussing publicly, your thoughts on this topic?
You can go to one of my websites if you Google me, Brett Burkhardt. I've got a lot of my writing available, and much of that is academic writing behind a paywall. But if you'd like to read more about that work, send me an email, and I'd be happy to share.
Okay, great. I thank you so much for being with us on America Trends today.
Thank you.
America Trends podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.